teachers call. Wiggle, wiggle, worm so wiggly. Wiggle, wiggle, oh so squiggly. Wiggle, wiggle, worm so wiggly. Wiggle, wiggle happily. Wiggle worm crawling through the dirt. Wiggle worm wearing a green skirt. Wiggle worm digging tunnels deep. Wiggle worm secrets it will keep. Wiggle, wiggle, worm so wiggly. Wiggle, wiggle, oh so squiggly. Wiggle, wiggle, worm so wiggly. Wiggle, wiggle happily. Wiggle worm, eating leaves so green. Wiggle worm, the best worm ever seen. Wiggle worm, growing big and strong. Wiggle worm, singing a happy song. Wiggle, wiggle.